Good evening, and welcome to a special guest edition of the Proteus Podcast. My name is Jacob.
My name's Max.
And we are here to tell you about bees.
Well, let's start. Ask me a question about bees,
Max,
Jake.
what do you know about bees?
Well, I know many things about bees. They're quite interesting insects and creatures, and we look like, well, we might have one of their distant relatives, some sort of wasp, in the studio right now. That's okay. We're safe, ladies and gents. But back to bees.
Back to bees.
They're quite interesting, quite remarkable. They seem to exist on, well, just about every continent except for
Antarctica.
Antarctica.
And I don't know for sure on that. I didn't actually check. But
I've never been to Antarctica, and I don't plan
they're
on going.
everywhere, and they play an important role in our lives by making sweet, delicious honey to put on our biscuits.
Well,
and by pollinating all of our plants so that we have more plants.
Indeed. Well, fruit, any kind of fruit-bearing trees, potatoes. Well, no, what is it? Potatoes? Yeah, I believe potatoes sprout. And they do make a bloom.
I don't know if they have to be pollinated to make a potato, but
well, we'll look into that. The point is, ladies and gents, there's a plethora of fruits, vegetables,
but tomatoes,
nuts,
which are cousins to potatoes, you do need a little pollination.
You do need a little pollination action going on.
And all of our favorite fruits and fruits, especially.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Yeah, there are a few things that are self-pollinators, plants out there that we eat, like corn, but that's a whole other game. But for all the good stuff, because corn doesn't count, even though it tastes nice, bees are where it's at.
Indeed. So
what you all don't know here is Max is a semi-professional amateur bee mover.
Semi-professional and amateur used in the same sentence. I like that because I'm not quite an expert, but I'm not quite a jack of all trades. It's something I've taken up out here. I don't know if the folks know in our part of the world. It stays fairly warm. We don't have real winters all the time, and the bees tend to move, migrate, and swarm quite frequently. Swarming is part of their natural behavior. I'm sure people have seen them. You'll see a kind of a clump, a ball-like looking thing, especially in the spring months, and people become quite alarmed. And some people will even call 911.
Big old wad of bees hanging out in my tree by my house.
And basically, what that wad of bees is doing is they are taking a break. Since bees don't smoke, obviously they don't take a cigarette break, but they are moving from point A to point B. Point B hopefully being a better point than point A was.
Looking for something to pollinate and make some honey with.
Basically, build a new home and a new colony. Looking for that ideal spot. So no need to be alarmed on that, folks. However, I have found that is the ideal time to gather them because they are usually quite gassed and tired, and it's quite easily to gingerly move them. Of course, I wear a suit and gloves and transport them into a box. I like to throw a spoonful of honey in to feed them since they're quite tired. And bees need a tremendous amount of water. I did not know this. Being in the desert, they need a good, steady supply of water. And that, folks, is why you will end up finding them in your sprinkler boxes trying to build a home. Yeah. It's a little annoying, but we have to deal with it.
Explain also for us out here in West Texas, the main place you see bees is around the water tanks on ranches or around your bird bath. They come to that water. You'll see huge swirls of bees getting water at at the few places there are water, that there is water available at the surface. So
very, very true.
Any small pond or even a puddle, you'll see bees stop by, and butterflies as well. The other pollinators stop and get a drink at any open water source.
Very, very, very true. I've noticed that over the years. I used to be slightly alarmed at times, and then I realized, oh no, they're just
thirsty like the rest of us.
So in the desert.
So, what's the most exciting time you've ever had moving bees?
Oh, the most exciting. I found a colony in a sprinkler box, which I regrettably had to dispatch because they were showing very strong aggressive behavior towards being, well, they were probably partly Africanized. I don't do blood work and genetic work on bees as a general rule.
Turns out that's really hard to tell. It's like lots of tiny measurements. Like the wings are going to be slightly shorter. I was glancing at things. To be able to tell if they're Africanized,
I've heard
other than the aggression, is a pretty tricky thing.
Well, I've heard that they can do a genetic test. They can test a bloodline just as you would test a bloodline on a dog, and it gives us some information. It's not a 100% type deal, but you can get an idea. However, having dealt with these bees and having been around other ones, I can tell you these ones are quite testy, and they were not very nice. They did not go quietly. Long story short, folks, I was mowing and weed eating for some people for pay. one of my regular, well, I say my regular side summer jobs. When we actually do get rain in this part of the world,
and
the grass
then you have
does
to mow
grow.
everything because it grows like a foot overnight.
He's not joking. This is basically true. I noticed what appeared to be some bees coming in and out of your standard size sprinkler box, and I let the owners know. So I went and donned my bee suit and very gingerly and gently pried the lid of the sprinkler box off, and it became an all-out brawl of sorts. Except I was in a suit, but if it would have been like someone like myself trying to fight Chuck Norris in his glory days, I would have not done well. I would have had to run for my life. They didn't want to be trifled with. Now, on the flip side of that, I have dealt with bees in my parents' backyard. They stored an old chest of drawers, which is evidently the ideal place to build a bee house. So if you have a whole chest of drawers and you set it outside, you might get
some bees.
You might get some bees that move in on you. These ones were quiet. I would say they are cool as They were cool as cucumbers, to use that phrase. Nobody uses that phrase anymore. Fairly easy to deal with, and they were transported to their new home, and as far as I know, they're doing all right. They weren't
well-behaved bees.
They were pretty well behaved. They weren't too testy.
Well, that's good.
They didn't try and kill me or anything else around there. So I was pleasantly surprised. So that's opposite ends of the spectrum.
So that's good. Well, seems like there's bees of every kind now. I was reading earlier that the University of Arizona figures that pretty much every wild colony in Arizona is slightly Africanized by now. So if you live in Arizona, be careful of your wild bees. They say your only real defense is to be able to do a good wind sprint of about a quarter mile.
Yes, he is
outrun them. Go into the wind and run. Don't get in the water; they'll wait for you. So,
or if you can jump in a pickup in a car that has the windows rolled up, and if you live in Arizona, you want the air conditioning to work, especially out here in Texas as well.
Yeah.
And wait them out. However, your only other option is just to run into the wind.
I have also heard that if you have to run away from the bees, as much as it sounds horrible, throw your shirt up over your face, so that they don't get in your mouth and nose. You're going to get stings to the torso, but that's better than to the head and face, which can restrict your breathing.
Very true. They target, like many insects, off the CO2 and the darker spots, so they are naturally drawn to your eyes, your mouth, your ears, and nose, etc.
So
protect those areas if you can in an emergency.
And run like you've never run before. If you can do that quarter mile, you should be okay, is what they say. But ideally, just if there's bees, leave them alone. They'll leave you alone for the most part. Don't poke the beehive with a stick, and you should be all right.
Yep.
So we've been reading a bunch about colony collapse because that's been in the news every week for the last, see here, where we are, 12 years.
Yeah, it has. I noticed that they wouldn't shut up about it for a long time. I thought the world was going to end.
It was really first noticed. I was doing some research on this subject. In 2006, they noticed this thing that they named colony collapse. And so approximately what happens with colony collapse is you come out one day as your commercial beekeeper and half of your colony is gone. And the queen's there and not enough worker bees are there, and they're usually immature. Basically all the mature working bees just leave. They don't know where they go. They're just gone.
Sounds like a midlife crisis
to
me.
All the working bees have a midlife crisis and leave mom and the kids at home and just go away.
Are they socialist bees? Well, let's not get into that.
It's really hard on the colony because you've got, it's hard for it to survive because all the bees that are left aren't mature yet usually. And caused a collapse in bee colonies. And the numbers on that are interesting though, because that happened, they first identified it and named it in 2006. And I'm trying to find my graphs, which I of course lost in the mad scramble to be ready to do this. But the gist of it is that at that time there was about 2.4 million bee colonies, and these are commercial bee colonies. They're the ones that are used for pollination and producing honey. These are the ones that they count when they look at these things. And as of the collapse in 2006, over the next couple years, it continued to happen. And it went to about 2.3 million colonies. We lost, 500,000 colonies of bees, which is a lot of bees, especially in terms of commercial, production. You're going to need those bees, But what happened after that is, since then, we've actually recovered all the bees that we lost and more. We are actually approximately 2.6 2.7 million bee colonies right now in commercial bees.
That's a lot of bees.
Which is more bees than we've had since like 1996, or thereabouts, right? So, fortunately, the collapse has basically been thwarted, and that's, again, only counted in the commercial bees because no one's counting the... Turns out it's really hard to go out and count wild bees. They're everywhere, and they don't tell you where they live. It's really hard to do.
You usually have to find them by accident, has been my experience.
Yeah.
All the wild bees that I've stumbled across, folks, have usually it's not been an intentional, hey, let's go find some bees. It's, hey, let's do something else. Holy guacamole, there's some bees living in that cave.
Yeah, holy guacamole, there's bees in this hollow tree. And then you gotta run away and, bees!
Well, I've never been attacked, but it's usually a mad dash back to the truck or the four-wheeler or whatever, means of transportation we've taken out.
Yeah. So we're right up to 2.7 million bee colonies and climbing as of the last data I have here, which is good. Giving the bees back. And we may have heard recently about them putting some bees on the endangered species list.
I did hear about that.
And it turns out all of those bees are a special subspecies of bee called the yellow-faced bee, and they're all native to Hawaii.
Oh, well.
So, and Hawaii being the very tiny place it is, and there's some very specific fauna and flora.
Very unique ecosystem.
Very unique ecosystem, very unique flora, and that these bees service exclusively. These are the only bees that pollinate these particular plants. So they're really, it's not so much that they're worried about they're not close to extinction by any regard, basically is what they're saying, but they want to be able to make sure they stay on that list and keep them conserved so that they don't risk losing both the bees and these plants that are tightly reliant on
symbiotic relationship.
It's the nature web there, and you need these bees to have these plants, and that plant probably feeds this animal, and so they're just preemptively taking care of that because it's such a microcosm ecosystem there that you can't. They're just, it's Hawaii. They're real careful about tampering with their ecosystem there. So that's what that was about. And it's not really a sign that bees are disappearing all over the world, which is good. We need bees.
Well, it's good for us because we need them to pollinate and eat, and we don't really want
I do enjoy honey on my biscuits.
I do too. I enjoy honey in many things.
So speaking of the agriculture, we learned that the United States, because with the colony collapse thing, there was a lot of things they looked at. They looked at, one of the first things I remember them talking about was is cell phone radiation killing bees? No, it's definitely not killing bees.
Just brain cells.
They checked that. The only thing that cell phones are doing to you is wasting your time. Then they wondered if it was pesticides. And the main pesticide we use now is, I had this right handy and I've lost it, is called a neonicotinoid. Basically a cordanoid, right? Or neonics is what they refer to them as. And the way these are used, they used to be used in a multitude of ways. They were sprayed on crops. They were tilled into the soil, and you treat the seeds before they plant them with it. And they've pretty much gone to just treating the seeds. And in the tests, all the tests they've done of bees that live in hives near crops with the treated seeds that have grown up, there's no appreciable amount of that pesticide in the bee colonies, and it doesn't seem to affect them at all. The studies they did earlier on that, does this pesticide affect bees, were done by taking some bees, putting them in a little box, and soaking them in pesticides, and it kills them. But that would probably kill me also, so it's not a fair test, and we don't use them in that fashion for the most part anymore. They don't just broadly spray these pesticides because it's inefficient. It's easier to treat all your seeds in a bucket, basically, and then plant them than it is to fly a plane back and forth and drive a big machinery and spray.
Get more bang for your buck.
Yeah,
you don't have to worry about.
And they can use 1/10 of the amount of pesticide as they used before. So it reduces the amount they have to buy. It's just as effective and doesn't mess with your bees, which is good. And then the other thing they looked at was people were really worried about genetically modified crops somehow affecting bees, and that's we don't know what it would do to them, but we want to check on that. And that has been pretty much shown to not be the case either. Where we had colony collapse in the United States, it wasn't happening in other countries that also use genetically modified crops of the same types. And especially, like, a good example was Canada. produces all the canola, which is a rapeseed canola oil. So they grow these canola plants, and they're all genetically modified at this point. They don't use any that aren't. They're modified to be, be better producing and, resistant to blight or whatever. All of their canola is genetically modified, and their bees that they pollinate those with have not experienced any colony collapse at all. So it's clearly not that. So what they think it is it's probably a giant combination of things. There is a mite. It's a parasitic mite that attacks specifically honeybees. That the normal honeybee and the Africanized honeybee. I actually looked into that because I was curious if Africanizing might reduce these mites, and it doesn't, unfortunately. But they affect the bees badly. Having a parasite is not very healthy for anything usually. And what that does is, this mite originated in Asia, and it's spread across every continent that has bees except for Australia. And it weakens the bee in general because it sucks its blood. Well, hemolymph, which is like blood for bees. It's a little different. And also it carries some viruses that affect bees. Causes a deformed wing virus. And carries a deformed wing virus, makes their wings too small, and a bunch of other various problems. So it's unhealthy for bees. What a lot of people probably don't know is most beekeepers expect to lose between 10 and 15% of their bees over the winter. It's just attrition. You're weaker. Less healthy bees die during the cold time. It's just part of bee life. They don't live very long anyways, but you tend to lose a few of that percentage over the winter. Once the mites got into the American bee population, that number went up from 10 to 15% to 20 to 30% of your colony will be lost over winter, which is happened approximately at the same time as colony collapse started to be recognized. So that's a big portion of it, is you're losing this part of the colony, more of the colony over the winter, and then some of your bees are just randomly leaving. And that, again, the randomly leaving thing has been observed over the last 100 years in bee colonies all over the world. It just happens, and it only was recently named. Egypt has had this happen. It's happened in Europe, and then they stop doing it and they come back. We don't know if those bees, and what we don't know is where those bees go. They might be flying away and dying. They might be going feral and becoming wild bees that aren't part of domesticated colonies. No one really knows what happens to those bees because they're tiny and it's hard to put the tracking collars on them.
I've never tried to track bees for the record.
And they're flighty little buggers, hard to watch. So we don't know, but what we do know is at this point the collapse in the United States has pretty much stopped, and they're basically just trying to treat for the mites to reduce the amount of mites on our bees because they're really hard to treat. So what else do we know about bees?
Well, the Africanized ones are not fun to deal with.
No.
They're quite testy.
So where did the Africanized bees come from?
Well, they came from Africa originally. They are honeybees. They are a unique subspecies. But to the average person, they're very difficult to distinguish. Africanized, the African bees in and of themselves, they're aggressive. They are honeybees. They're fairly productive. They're just not as conducive to domestication and producing. In the 1950s, some gentleman whose name escapes me, and his company decided it would be a good idea to try and cross the European honeybees, some of the subspecies, the Italian bees, the Germans, with the ones from Africa that were particularly hardy and did very well in a festering tropical jungle environment. So they took them to Brazil, which is somewhat of a tropical festering environment, depending on what part you go to, and they had an escape.
It says 26 swarms escaped the quarantine.
Yep, 26, and they moved. Africanized bees are much more prone to moving if the colony is disturbed. All bees will move if disturbed enough, whether they be domesticated or not. There's certain steps that the beekeepers take to avoid that. However, the Africanized ones, it doesn't just take a whole lot, and they'll pack their bags and say, well, off into the bush we go, and we'll move. And so after, from the 1950s and until the 80s, when they officially were spotted and recognized in the U.S., they made their way up through Central America, parts of South America, into Mexico, and ultimately into parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and there may be some other spottings of them elsewhere, but Texas, I know, has a very high proportion of Africanized bees, especially down in South Texas, in Hidalgo, Cameron, Webb counties, down in what they call the Lower Rio Grande Valley, which is incidentally also a very heavily farmed agricultural area. So
yeah, that's explains where they come from. They're not friendly, we know that, and they are virtually all the way across the American South now. There have been incidences in Georgia and Louisiana, and they are absolutely cover, like we spoke of, Arizona. They, oddly enough, as far as I know, aren't as much in New Mexico, but half of the southern half of California and Nevada are definitely, there are Africanized bees in those areas. We wondered earlier if I'm curious if their advance north will be halted once they get to colder climates. If their if their semi-subtropical nature will halt that expansion, or if they will intermingle with the local bees enough to be able to handle the colder weather.
That's a very good
winter
question.
Over like they do.
It'll be very interesting in the next 10 or 10.
We should know. Years. I would say in the next 10 years probably, if they can advance, past the central United States.
Yeah, well, I know, especially when you get to the northern part of Arizona and New Mexico, from having been up there in the fall and the winter, it gets cold.
It does,
and it's not really, it's not conducive for any kind of tropical species of anything that I'm aware of.
So that'll be interesting to see where the spread of those will halt. So, but anyways, we were talking about the mites, and it turns out there's just about a dozen ways of dealing with those mites. There's miticides that you can put on the bees, but you have to be really careful not to contaminate any honey that might be consumed by humans. And then there's a whole lot of other things. There's a bunch of synthetic chemicals, and then there's formic acid they use. Oddly enough, powdered sugar can be used. Or talc, it's anything that they consider a safe powder. It has to have a grain size between 5 and 15
microns?
Picometers. Real small. And it can be sprinkled on the bees, and it basically will suffocate the mites.
Really? Interesting.
Because they can't, it crowds them out, suffocates them. Then there's some essential oils and things like that.
So, folks, you can powder sugar your bees.
You can sugar your bees, and theoretically...
theoretically, they will be
okay. Rid of your mites.
And they may taste better.
They say food-grade mineral oil as a vapor and direct application on paper or cords and eradicate them. I don't know all the details of how these are used, but these are some of the things they try.
Interesting.
And it's a big deal, though, because if you can get rid of the mites, your bees are going to do a lot better.
And it's just like a human being having a parasite.
Yeah.
I've never had a parasite, but...
Weirdly enough, if they heat the hive frames to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, and hold it there for several hours, it causes the mites to drop off the bees.
Really?
And then there's something called the perforated bottom board, which makes they use, and the mites go through that, and you get the mites separate from the bees and kill them and get rid of them.
Interesting.
So there's a whole bunch of things. There's a company in Germany and a company in the Czech Republic that are making special hives that can be it uses a solar system to heat the hive occasionally and
keep them mite free.
Help get rid of the mites. So it's a big deal right now to be able to get rid of these mites safely and not contaminate your honey.
Yeah.
For so that you still got food honey. So there's a lot of methods I've been reading about for dealing with that. But one of the problems we have that might have contributed to our colony collapse here in the United States, I was reading, is we're the only country that does this. Is 90% of all of the commercial bees in the United States get trucked to California in the spring to pollinate the almond crops.
Indeed, that is true.
And that's really hard on them, from what I'm seeing.
True.
That's when they're kind of they got to wake up and get going and get some food and start being bees again. And now you're shipping them across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that does two things. I mean, it stresses weak bees as they're coming out of their more dormant wintering over state. And also it's getting all your bees in one area, so any parasites and viruses that they have can be shared. All these bees are going to interact to some extent in these fields. And so it's like getting everybody together, and then everyone when they go on for a family reunion, and everybody goes home with the same cold that Jimmy brought.
Exactly.
Kind of a thing. And it's been suggested that is doing a lot to weaken our domestic bee population and make them less resistant to the mites, because you're getting them all together at their weakest time, and and then you're taking them away and letting them reproduce. And so that they need to look at that, I think. But that's something that they're trying to address. Get rid of the mites, maybe handle our pollination systems for commercial crops a little differently. Not
well, more localized. I think you had mentioned to me earlier.
I think, but that's just me guessing. I'm not a beekeeper yet.
Well,
also on a commercial scale, that you'd have to have a fantastic number of bees in local areas.
Well, California is the San Joaquin is a highly there's a lot of agricultural stuff going on there. So I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility doing it, but
that's something that apparently they do need to address. So that's interesting, anyways. And we are unusual in this country that we do that. As far as I could tell, no other country hauls so many bees so far.
Well, they winter bees down here south of where we live. There's a place called Redford, Texas. There's absolutely nothing down there. Very, very little used to be farming, and they will take their bees down there from various places, from Colorado, New Mexico, other places that tend to get colder, and they'll let them. They have fields along the Rio Grande, and they will set them out in the wintertime. Folks, it never really gets all that cold down in that part of the world. That being Presidio County, and it's almost it's sometimes almost kind of a subtropical climate, and they do quite well. Plenty of water. Plenty of mesquite and other natural wildflowers, and then later on in the warmer months, they move them out. They put them on 18-wheelers and they truck them north to various farms and ranches, so on and so forth.
So we're getting close to the end here, but let's run through some fun bee facts that I learned while doing all this.
All right, let's hear them.
Turns out there are 25,000 known species of bees worldwide.
Good gravy.
4,000 of those alone are in the United States, and Britain, being the little island it is, has 250 species of bees.
250 species of bees.
Yeah,
wow.
So that's amazing. And Australia, as we mentioned before, is the only place in the world that has bees that doesn't have that parasite, the Vora parasite. And it's also, I think this is just the only nice thing that happened to Australia when they were getting animals, because they got all the most dangerous, poisonous, venomous, and vicious animals, is they got the stingless bee. There's a honeybees. Honeybees in Australia, they have a stinger, but it's underdeveloped and isn't defensive, so they can't sting anything.
Wow!
But they do produce honey.
There's
about 500 species of these stingless honeybees in Australia.
That is amazing. Of all the things to kill you in Australia, the bees probably won't.
That's unusual. So that's one more reason to visit Australia, is play with the bees. But we've learned a lot about bees today, and I'm pretty happy with what I know now. The bee apocalypse is just has been overstated by the media because there's nothing else to talk about. And it's still important to do what you can to not cause trouble for bees.
True.
Because they are very, very important to our ecosystem. If you like food, you should probably get used to bees.
Yep.
Especially if you like plants.
Very true. Very true indeed.
So anyways, if you like what you heard here today, you can follow us on Stitcher and other fine podcast purveying establishments. You can follow us on Twitter to be updated when new podcasts are posted. And you can follow us on YouTube to see some of our podcasts there. And if you have comments or suggestions for a topic, you can email them to proteuspodcast@gmail.com. So all that being said, I've been Jacob.
I'm still Max.
And we have been the Proteus Podcast. Good night, everyone.